You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. We are talking to Shaunti Feldhahn, who is the author of The Male Factor. The Male Factor looks at what men privately think about the words and actions of women in the workplace. She's a bestseller, over 2 million copies of her books being sold in 20 different languages. She went to Harvard, she worked on Wall Street and on Capitol Hill, and she is here today on the Goldstein on Gelt show. Shaunti, I'd like to welcome you.
It is terrific to be with you.
Thanks so much. Listen, I want to ask you, you reveal quite a bit about how men observe and process and perceive a woman's actions and behaviors. So based on your findings, how do men view emotion at work? How do they deal when women are emotional, or when they are emotional for that matter?
You know, there are so many areas that we as women think that we understand some things, and I realized based on all the research I did that we really don't understand this. See, we know that men are a bit uncomfortable with certain emotions in the workplace. And, you know, as women, we think if you kind of fighting back tears, we think that's unprofessional. It's not appropriate in a workplace setting. But what I realized is that we don't understand how they view it really when they see it. It is way more than viewing it as unprofessional. And we also don't realize what they view as getting emotional to begin with. It's way more than fighting back tears. See, what happens with the male brain, the male and female brains are actually wired quite differently in how they process emotion. The male brain is wired to do one thing at a time, right? And so it's actually quite difficult for a guy to be processing a thought and a feeling and emotion at the same time. So men like you know, you've learned you need to sort of filter out or shut out some of those emotions in order to think clearly. But what that means is that if you're not necessarily thinking clearly when a flood of emotion is coming at you, you look at a female colleague who's getting emotional and you think she's not thinking clearly either. And so I realized in all these interviews with men that men tend to view the presence of emotion as meaning that logic has ceased. Mm-hmm. And that actually may, and in fact, sometimes be the case with men, but with women, our brains are actually wired to be able to process a pretty high degree of emotion and still be thinking very clearly. It's just a different way of looking at it, but men don't know that. So I heard, you know, consultants or other people I interviewed, they'd say things like, oh, I was so bummed that, you know, this female colleague of mine kind of shut down and got defensive in this meeting because it meant I couldn't trust her judgment of the whole meeting. And that I'm going to have to redo this meeting when people are thinking clearly, as opposed to realizing, you know what, she can actually be a bit emotional and still have perfectly good judgment. It's just a different way of looking at it. And the reason I did all these interviews is that it's actually really important for us as women to know what men are privately thinking about these things that they would never say. Very important for us.
I see. And do you think this is hardwired or taught or developed over time?
You know, I'm sure that whole nature and nurture debate can go on forever, and I'm sure it's a bit of both, but there is no getting around the fact that over the past 10, 15 years, we have made some incredible strides in understanding neuroscience and how the brain is wired. And it turns out that, like, for example, this issue of a difficulty with men processing a thought and a feeling at the same time, that's a hardwired thing in the male brain. And the female brain is wired to be able to do this multi-processing. So right there, that's baked in the cake. And that's really the kind of stuff that I was trying to dig out in the book. I was really trying to focus not on the stuff that everybody's heard before, as good as some of that might be. You know, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I was really trying to dig out the stuff that we just don't know as women, especially that once we know it about how men are thinking and feeling and perceiving our words and our actions, the better we know that, the more influential, the more effective that we can be in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. You discovered one key reason behind the double standard, I guess we've all seen, where a man is viewed as, if he's strong, he's viewed as assertive, which is positive, whereas that a woman with that same trait would be considered difficult. What's going on? What's going on under the surface there?
You know, we women have absolutely no clue how much self-doubt is running underneath the surface of all these confident-looking men around us. See, we think, oh gosh, this guy is just being threatened by a strong and competent woman. We come in and we've been coached in business coaching to come in, take no prisoners, be aggressive, be assertive, and we don't realize that running underneath the surface of our male colleagues, there's some self-doubt, there's some insecurity, there's questioning. I want to tackle a challenge, but at the same time, I'm worried that someone's going to walk in and figure out that he has no idea what he's doing. And we women, we have plenty of insecurities of our own, but that doesn't tend to be one of them. And so what's happening so often is by some of these approaches, we're hitting, it's almost like a raw nerve, and we're hitting that nerve without realizing that that's what we're doing, and certainly without ever intending to. And so for example, I heard this so many times from the men that I interviewed and surveyed. So often, we'll be in a meeting of, 5-10 people in a conference room trying to figure something out. And, I'll raise my hand and I'll say, Bob, why did you choose that pricing? And I'm just asking for information. But Bob, because he has a bit of self-doubt under the surface of whether he did a good job with this, he's thinking to himself, are you challenging me in front of my team? Are you telling me I don't know what I'm doing? And of course, no, that's not what we're doing, but it can be heard that way.
But is that because you're a woman? Is that because if a man had asked the exact same question with the exact same words, would he have felt the same way?
You know what? We actually found that most of the time, yes. And if you look at it, men avoid asking those questions that way. It's one of the most fascinating dynamics here is because we've all been told and have heard, you got to be direct, you got to be assertive, and all of that is true. But the question is, how?
I'm not sure it's true. Maybe it's just, shouldn't people consider being, if you're so assertive and direct in front of someone else, in front of a group, certainly it could embarrass people, right? I mean, I would think that everyone should be trained to ask in a polite, non-threatening way, especially if it's just an informational question.
Well, part of the issue, unfortunately, is that some of the coaching that I have received as a woman in the workplace and many of my female colleagues have received actually doesn't encourage us to be polite about it. It encourages us to be direct and aggressive and assertive. And, there may be times and places for that, absolutely. But here's the problem. Men have, because the surveys found that 3 out of 4, no matter how I asked the question, and these surveys were extremely expensive, extremely rigorous to try to get good data, no matter how we asked the question, about 3 out of 4 men said that they are not as confident as they look. And that what that is that raw nerve that we can hit without realizing it. And men recognize that the existence of that nerve in each other. And so they tend to ask a question like they'll raise their hand in a meeting and say, Bob, help me understand the reason for that pricing. Same question. It's just done differently. It's not the why type question. And that's an example of something that's so little. But it was so common. Again, about 3 out of 4 men said that would tend to trigger this feeling in them that I'm being challenged in front of my team. And that is just a simple example of something that happens every day in the workplace, which is why I felt like we as women especially need to get a handle on this. Because, you, Doug, you were telling me about how you moved to Israel, and, it's a different culture. I'm sure there were things that, you and anyone who has moved into a different country or a different culture has gone, okay, I need to learn this, and I need to understand how that is perceived. I realized when working with men, it's kind of like working with a foreign culture. They just have different expectations and different perceptions of things.
I hear. We are talking with Shaunti Feldhahn, who is the author of The Male Factor. She's a best-selling author, having sold over 2 million books, and she studies what men think about women in the workplace in terms of, let's just say, how women are acting, and we're talking about emotions, and also we touched a little bit before about being polite. So I'd like to go a little bit further on this. I certainly one of the issues that I've seen, having started, let's say, on Wall Street about 20 years ago, when my job was basically about building relationships. And now I find, young people come in, like young marketing experts, and they come to me and they want me to hire them to handle my marketing for my company. And they say, Doug, everything should be, tweeted and Facebooked. And, and I even said, well, I'm about relationships. I like to learn about people. And they just didn't get it. And I'm wondering about what you were saying is, that people maybe ask a question in a rude way, whereas it could have been asked nicely. Is this something new? Like in in the old days when I was younger and starting in business, were people just naturally more polite, so this didn't come up?
I actually don't know the answer to that, because one of the things that I was very careful to focus on in my research, I could have gone in a whole bunch of different directions and not had any good results come out of it. So I actually don't know whether some of these trends really wouldn't have happened 20 or 30 years ago. My guess is that what I was trying to focus on was truly the stuff that is common to all men, and how they view certain situations with their female colleagues. And it didn't change by race or age or orientation or level of seniority. None of that changed. It was common across all the spectrums. And if it did change, if black men answered something differently than white men, then I didn't include it, because by definition there's something else going on there other than just men. So my guess is that most of this is stuff that is very hardwired, and it's very related to the male brain. But I don't know for sure whether 30 years ago it would have been different.
All right. Shaunti, we're just about out of time, but maybe you could leave us with one or two tips for the men who are listening about how they should deal with their female colleagues and managers.
Well, one of the things that I realized is that men have a subconscious set of unwritten rules. They view the workplace just exists in this way where these are just the laws of gravity. They didn't come up with them. They just found the workplace this way. And those unwritten rules, they think, sort of frame how everything should operate. And if they see a woman, especially men too, but it especially affects women, if they see her operating by ways that kind of are different than what they think the rules of the workplace should be, they can view that person as, she's a good utility player, but not so much leadership material. Like, for example, one of the rules is you leave personal feelings at home. That belongs back in personal world. Personal feelings belong there, not here. But to realize, actually, women's brains are wired to be unable to pull out those personal feelings and to be able actually to think very clearly, very logically, even in the face of those personal feelings. So what you view as taking something personally, getting emotional, is actually not the weakness that you think it is. It's actually a sign of the same type of brain wiring that makes women really good listeners. It's the same type of brain wiring that allows a woman across the table on a deal to be able to read the body language of the people across the table at a much earlier level and say, I think these people might have some reservations about the deal, and call that out. That's a huge strength. Well, it's the flip side of that same brain wiring. So just realize for the men as well, these things are hardwired, and to really realize they need to confront some of their assumptions that they're weaknesses.
Okay. Shaunti Feldhahn, author of The Male Factor. Thank you very much. Could you just tell us the very last sentence, which is how can people follow your work and learn more?
Sure. My website is themalefactorbook.com.
themalefactorbook.com. Shaunti Feldhahn, thanks once again for joining us.
Thanks, Doug.
Take care.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.